Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. My name is TC Ricks / Rhombus Ticks, and today we are going to take a diversion from our usual podcast schedule and focus on something that I consider very timely. So for long-time listeners, you would recall that last year I did a single episode called During the Coup, where I explained my perspective on a lot of things, and specifically how when I used to be a Mormon missionary in 1993, there was a coup attempt in Venezuela, and what that was like, and what that felt like, and what it was building up to it, and then the immediate aftermath, and how that's affected my perspective on a lot of things, including our current political situation in the U.S. And the year before that, in 2020, I did a series called After the Coup, in which, in order to get people to vote, I helped people understand, to summarize, if a coup happens, and once a coup happens, it's going to be really, really difficult to put things back together again. A lot has changed in the 2 years since I did that original series, which, by the way, you can hear in audiobook form on YouTube. Just Google Rhombus Ticks. You'll see my YouTube channel immediately. And if you go to the audiobooks playlist, you'll see, among many other audiobooks, the compilation of After the Coup. And then once this is done in November, there'll be 5 episodes in this series. I'll include Before the Coup, During the Coup, and After the Coup in his audiobook that I'm going to call The Coming Coup. I did not want to have to make this series. I had hoped that when we got what was basically a miracle 2 years ago, where we got the Senate and we got the House, barely, that a concerted effort would be made to fight the forces of fascism that are rising in this country. And there's good news and bad news. Anybody who's paying any attention to the news can see that, but I'm going to focus a little bit on the good news, right? The good news is Trump is on the run, right? He has been unequivocally proven to be a criminal to anyone but a conservative or MAGA at this point. The most jarring, and at the time I made the first series 2 years ago, unknown complaint / crime that he has committed is the taking of top secret documents, potentially selling them to foreign adversaries. So Trump is going down, almost assuredly. Everybody, after the Dobbs decision, recognizes that the Republican Party is Fruit Loops. They're just off the chain. Everybody understands that. That's common knowledge. What I don't think is common knowledge is just how serious this situation is. And that is what most of this episode today is going to be about, right? In other words, I'm going to give a best case scenario and I'm going to give a worst case scenario for why I still think a coup is, or at least a coup attempt, is inevitable at this point, and why you should consider starting to prepare for one. So let me talk a little bit about how the structure of this particular series is going to go. This episode, as I said, I'm going to explain the context, why I believe a coup is, or at least a coup attempt, is inevitable. And why I think it's necessary to prepare for it at this point. There will be 4 episodes after this where I'm going to give actual practical advice depending on which strategy you choose. Personally, I think it would be wise for you to listen to all of them, because even if you choose to run, for example, knowing things to do to hide or to give advice to other people who want to passively fight and provide resistance without necessarily being violent about it, will help you do so. Like I said, there'll be 4 episodes after this where I'm going to include what I believe and have done some research on is practical, actual advice on things you can do to prepare yourself and your loved ones for what's coming. And again, it may not succeed, right? The first episode will be hide. After this, how can you hide in this country? And some of that will be actual hiding, and some of that will be hiding in plain sight. It's not a fun thing to do. If you want to be safe, you're going to have to potentially do things that you will not find nice. The second episode after that is going to be run. Running to another country is more difficult than you think it is, and I'm going to include some things that I have learned and researched. Full disclosure, that's my current strategy, right? If in 2025 DeSantis becomes president, I'm gone. And I'm going to try and get as many of my family members to go as they can as well. Because if you listen to what I discuss in After the Coup, you'll understand just how long the odds are of succeeding once the coup happens, if it succeeds. The third episode after that is going to be passive, nonviolent resistance. Things you can do short of picking up a gun to fight against the regime, whether that is an underground railroad scenario or sabotaging passively in a critical infrastructure. There's all kinds of things you can do, most of which will be illegal and still highly dangerous, but don't involve violence. And then the last one I'm going to call Live by the Sword, Die by the Sword, where if you're not a member of the military recruited by someone that is not going to allow DeSantis to take over the country, why it's basically a really poor idea for you to do anything violent except defend yourself, which you still will want to do. And I will include advice on learning how to do that in that episode. I never make a series like this without offering a solution. And at this point, my solution is that we need a new constitution. If you don't listen to the rest of the series, that is the summary, which is to say a coup is inevitable at this point. Our current system and our current constitution are irretrievably broken. And I believe that the only way to fix it is a new constitution. So I'm going to be doing in spring of next year, after I do Project NIMBY, which will be 7 short stories that I'm currently selling or will be shortly selling in a chapbook, along with poetry called Water and Glass. It will be a series of humorous anecdotes followed by me talking about why that particular thing is necessary in the new Constitution, or how we can get a new Constitution without an Article 5, and why it is good to want a new Constitution and not be terrified of what the conservatives might do. Fear is the mind killer. I will not fear. That's from a quote from Dune. Anyway, that's the structure of the series. So let's start first and foremost with background on how we got here. So you can pick a lot of different places, but the turning point for me, where I'm going to put this story starting, is Citizens United. For those not familiar, there's a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United, wherein the court basically said, by a very slim majority, that money is speech and that campaign finance regulations were unconstitutional for almost all of them. And what that did is it allowed Republican/fascist dark filth money to pour in vast, huge amounts, especially in state races, where organizations like the Family and ALEC and basically the Koch network, later followed by Peter Thiel and other tech billionaires and filth billionaires, organized slow Republican destructive gerrymandering, which has gotten worse and worse and worse. That to me was the beginning of the end, right there. 2 other factors that contributed to it were Fox News, when it came out in 1994, and no challenge was made to them, because the Constitution says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech, that means that if you say money is speech, then you can't stop anybody from spending any amount of money to say anything they want ever, which automatically makes the rich more powerful and have more speech and gives them their already considerable advantages more advantages. And it also makes lying legal, right? If lying is protected speech, then in the marketplace of ideas, I can sell you spam and call it beef stroganoff. And there's no account for that, except, of course, for the voters potentially holding them to account later. But if you are a fascist and a fascist party, and you get voted into power based on lies, then how are the voters going to hold you accountable? Long story short, we all know that 3 court seats were stolen. That's more recent history. And the fact of the matter is that this has been a plan for a long time. Again, people far more intelligent than I am have documented this very well. Google the family, Google the history of the Supreme Court and the Federalist Society, on and on and on and on. That's not what this podcast is about, and that's not even what this episode is about. If you are politically informed, and I'm assuming you are if you're listening to this, because there are certainly far more informed sources. You've probably heard of something called Moore v. Harper. And in case you haven't, or just as a refresher if you have, Moore v. Harper is a Supreme Court case that the current court has in their docket that is going to authorize a pernicious little thing called the independent state legislature theory. And what that is if you actually read the wording of the actual Constitution, which very few conservatives and apparently the court very rarely pay attention to, except for their own convenience, basically says that the democratic state process, i.e. elections, are to be determined by the state legislatures. Now, the Constitution, in case you're unaware, does actually say that states have to have democratic systems, right? In other words, you can't say that the state of Louisiana or the state of Florida is suddenly going to become a monarchy and can do whatever the hell it wants under the federal system, right? It does have to be democratic. But if you read the wording exactly as written and you're on meth, you could make the flawed interpretation that only the state legislatures have the power to control federal elections in their state, meaning that if the governor is a Democrat or the state Supreme Court are Democrats and they don't agree per your state constitution what it is that you're supposed to do, then the heavily gerrymandered, heavily insane, toxic Republican state legislatures can ignore their state constitutions, can ignore their state laws, and ignore federal state laws, and basically say, we're going to ignore what the people voted for when it comes to choosing the president of the United States, and we, the Republican legislature, for whatever reason we so choose, are going to basically say that DeSantis or Trump is the president. Let me do the math for you, folks. If you count only blue states, it is mathematically impossible, even if you have the majority in terms of people, for a Democrat to win. Just like it's impossible if you are only winning core red states, i.e. ignoring swing states, for a Republican to win. But most of the swing states, again due to gerrymandering and Citizens United, have Republican state legislatures, which means if the Roberts Rate Court passes Moore v. Harper, then state legislatures can ignore a federal election and appoint the delegates to the Electoral College by fiat. if you listen to and accept as legitimate what the court is going to do, right? I'll be honest, folks. This is a declaration of war. If the Supreme Court does this, this is for me a declaration of war. If we get to January 20th, 2025, and the Electoral College ignores the popular vote again and supersedes the election and chooses a Republican president when the majority of the population wants a Democratic one, then the Constitution is null and void. And the Republican Party has declared war on the rest of the country. And if it's a declaration of war, there are things that are acceptable in war that are not acceptable in other circumstances. You've heard the phrase, all's fair in love and war. Well, if they declare war on the rest of us, it is a civil war. Now, it might be a civil war where a single bullet is never shot, where our population passively accepts this and maybe protests in the streets and get run over or killed by Republican paramilitaries. I go into the details of what constitutes a coup and how to recognize one in the other series I did during the coup and after the coup. But suffice to say that it's not a pretty scenario, no matter how you spell it. To avoid this, I'm going to give you the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. And even the best case scenario has problems. The best case scenario to avoid this is if this year the Democrats take the House and the Senate and in the next 2 years pass federal voting legislation which makes it perfectly clear that the Supreme Court is not to find the independent state legislature theory valid. Congress is a co-equal branch to the courts, and if you read the Constitution, it's very clear that of the three powers, executive, legislative, or judicial, the actual supreme power belongs to the legislature. And while the court has given itself the power to declare something unconstitutional, the theory goes that the Congress can null that decision of the court. And the reason that's the case is because it's pretty much left to the court, to the legislature, carte blanche to determine what the courts can do, what the subcourts are. In other words, our entire current judicial system, circuit courts, federal courts, how many members there are of the Supreme Court, the ethics of the Supreme Court, has all been decided by federal legislation. Nor does it actually say in the Constitution that the Supreme Court has the ability to interpret the Constitution, but someone does. And because everybody in the country recognizes those decisions, which I now think after Dobbs we should not, the court has soft power. But if the Congress passes a law saying the Supreme Court has no jurisdiction over determining whether state electors are determined by state legislature or the state constitutions, only state constitutions apply, that's going to be pretty much the end of the matter. The Supreme Court might say no, but it would be very easy for Biden and the powers that be, if you hold the presidency, to tell the courts to go pound sand, which I think they would. Here's the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is that the Democrats get the Senate, but not the House, which means there is no federal voting legislation. Let's ignore the risks of the debt ceiling and even being able to pass a budget, which will cause a major economic crisis because the Republican caucus in the House is going to be a clown festival. But, and just talk about the fact that without this legislation, if the court passes this Moore v. Harper and says that the independent state judiciary thing exists, and we know the court, after Dobbs, is shameless, so they're going to do it, right? I mean, it's not even speculation. They have no fear at this point. They will find for the independent state legislature theory. They're going to, full stop. The odds are drastically likely that they will. So if the court passes this thing, and we don't have federal legislation because the Democrats don't control the House anymore, then we get to 2024 and there's a crisis, right? Because everybody knows at this point, the handwriting is very clearly on the wall, that the Republicans are going to steal the presidency. But there's nothing in the Constitution that lets you stop the courts except two things. Number one is legislative. We could pass a law that says, fuck you, Supreme Court, and that would work. Or we can pull an Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson, in a very bad way, ignored a Supreme Court decision that said, don't do the Trail of Tears, don't commit genocide against the Cherokee tribe. It is unconstitutional for you to do what you're doing. And Jackson, who was the commander of the military, basically said, fuck you, Supreme Court. I'm going to do it anyway. He did, and nothing happened. If Biden chose to have the military arrest all of the Republican members of the state legislature, or state legislatures that are going to try and steal the presidency, there would be a revolt, but he could find enough soldiers, for sure, as commander-in-chief, making the argument that what the Supreme Court decided is clearly in violation of the Constitution. And by the way, it definitely is. If you look at both decisions made by the court itself and just fucking common sense, right? What is the point of requiring every state to have a state constitution if the state legislature can utterly ignore their own state constitution for federal elections? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And only a conservative that lives in clownland would ever even imagine such a warped Twilight Zone theory. But Biden, let's be honest, folks, Biden's had some victories in the last couple of months. He got the Inflation Reduction Act. He hit it out of the park in terms of Ukraine. He's finally started calling the Republicans semi-fascists. Like, what is a semi-fascist, right? That's like saying you have half a shit sandwich. Would you still eat a sandwich if it had any bit of shit in it? Right? You're either a fascist or you're not a fascist. It's that simple, right? There isn't really a spectrum for fascism. You either feel that it's okay to take the government by force or you don't. And the conservatives who have gotten this far, none of them, well, I can hear them howling in the background saying, well, if you think the president shouldn't enforce a flawed Supreme Court decision, then you're just as much of an insurrectionist as they are. And my counterpoint to that is, that's stupid, right? If the Supreme Court found that the Constitution says that it's okay to murder people, should Biden enforce that, right? That's just stupid. Okay, and the fact of the matter is that he has to be able to, as commander-in-chief, take a bad decision and be able to ignore it if it's literally the threat of the entire republic. At the end of the day, Congress gives the President of the United States vast and unprecedented powers. And part of the reason he's supposed to have those powers is because the executive is supposed to be a final safeguard against our own darker natures, right? The whole reason the executive is written the way it is in the current 1789 Constitution is that if something like this happens, like there's aliens invade, there's a major disaster, something that Congress, which is slow, and the courts, which are slow, does not have time to deal with, you need one guy in charge of the Army, in charge of the Department of Homeland Security, in charge of the police, and all these other things to act as a commander. And if you have a situation where you have a theocratic, corporate, filth money Supreme Court ignore the plain and simple logic of the Constitution in this area, then it is totally within the powers of the president to lawfully and legally tell the court to go fucking pound sand and to tell the FBI to arrest any state legislators that are going to try and steal the election this way. But ignoring the victories that Biden has had in the last 3 or 4 months, if you look at the rest of his presidency, Mr. Biden is not exactly the kind of guy who's going to go off the reservation, right? He's not going to do cowboy diplomacy. He is not going to send the steamship into Japan against Japanese imperial law and say, you're going to stop killing our sailors like Perry did several hundred years ago. The point being is that Biden is old, and while Biden has gotten some chutzpah, he doesn't have enough. If you believe that Biden is going to ignore the court, you don't understand Biden and haven't been paying attention. So if Biden can't stop or won't stop an illegal Supreme Court decision, and the Democrats don't control the House and the Senate, then who's going to stop it? The answer is no one. But let's go back to the best case scenario, right? Even if the Democrats take the House and the Senate and pass a law that says the independent state legislature theory is garbage, right? And that lets the Democrats win very likely in 2024. And let's say the Democrats even win in 2028, which is no guarantee. Do you seriously think that the Republican Party is ever going to stop being fascist now that it is fascist, right? Let's look at Italy. Italy, unlike Germany, did not have a truth and reconciliation period. There was no shame in Italy about fascism. They just felt that they were just as much victims as he was, and because let's just say they took care of their Mussolini problem in World War II, the Italians largely, to some justification, felt that they were on the side of the Allies by the time the thing was over. And because there was not truth and reconciliation, because the Italians, unlike the Germans, do not have something in their constitution that basically says no Nazis, no fascism, free speech good, unlimited free speech not going to happen. In Germany, you cannot say you're a Nazi and go on and talk about how awesome Hitler was. They don't have unlimited free speech in Germany. And by the way, Germany is the most prosperous, the most powerful country in Europe. The EU would not be possible without Germany. So telling me that unlimited speech is mandatory ignores Germany. Italy has no such provision. And because Italy ignores its fascist history, because nobody said there can't be any more fascist parties, the remains of Mussolini's party, even though they were on the fringe for a number of years, have been around for decades. And the current leader of the Italian government is basically from a party that traces its roots straight back to fascism. So if you expect me to believe that the Republican Party is going to suddenly go back to the way it used to be in the 80s and 90s and aughts, where it wasn't fascist, and that it didn't think that stealing elections was okay, and it didn't feel like any trick or any power, any dirty trick or method to power and preserving and retaining power was okay, then I've got a bridge I want to sell you. I mean, it's just utterly naive to believe that whoever the Republican candidate is in 2028 or 2032 or 2036 is going to be good, right? Unless you have a constitution that makes Fox News illegal, that makes dark money illegal, that makes lying on social media, if you are a politician or a news organization, illegal. If we don't make organizations like the Proud Boys illegal, then it is inevitable that people will get tired of the Democrats. They will forget January 6th, and they will forget Moore versus Harper, and they will forget Dobbs, and they will say, fuck you, Democrats, I'm going over here with the Republicans because the Republicans are promising me tax cuts and all kinds of fake things that they're never going to actually give me, and will be voted into the presidency. It only takes one Republican president to destroy this country. Only one. And even if we stop them in 2024 and 2028, sooner or later, a Republican president will be elected again. And do you think that they're going to suddenly stop being the party of dirty tricks and the party of voter suppression or the party that hates minorities or the party that hates LGBT? They will not. So learning what to do if there's a coup attempt, learning about the importance of stopping it and why we need to change the rigged rules in the 1789 Constitution is our only shot.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!